Okay, so in this session, we're going to have a little look at this source usefulness question, 8 marker. So this is question 1B on the trenches paper or question 3A on the Germany paper. Very, very similar in what we need to do. So just thinking about our mock exam recently and some of the issues that we had, I feel like this is quite a useful place to start on how to answer this question. Pause or stop this video as you go through and have a little go maybe. Have some of the sources in front of you that are in your Operation 9 to 5 books or on the website or anywhere you've got sources. Listen to what we're saying and then have a go. Okay, let's get going. So the issue, we've got plenty of issues with this, I think, looking at your mocks. I think possibly we need to think about, have we overcomplicated things? Have we given you too much of a to-do list for each point and you're trying to do too much? As we go through this session, we'll see and hopefully deal with some of those things and get them sorted. The struggle is indeed real. All right, so some of the language we need to be thinking about when we think about these source usefulness questions. Effectively, folks, we need to say that the source is useful and how the source is useful. All sources are useful no matter what. Okay, so thinking about some of these things, looking at the examiner's feedback and some of the things that we've talked about, you've got to try and be positive, all right? Don't just criticise the sources. As easy as it is to say, oh, this was made by somebody who was there, this is good, or this was written by a historian 60 years later, that means it's bad. We need to be a lot more critical than that. That's just too easy. Secondly, we need to be thinking about just because it was written after the time doesn't mean it's not useful. Too many of us in our exams, we sort of write off a source just because it was from after the time, even if it was 2 years after, as is the case with this mock when we were looking at the X-ray photograph of the X-rays, mobile X-rays. It's still useful. The quotes, this is the bit that's going to get us some marks, even if we're really, really struggling in this question. Just pick something out of the source. At absolute best, it's better to write something than nothing. So look at the source, read it. If you get really stuck, just think to yourself, I don't know anything, so how is this useful to teach me something? It may be a description of a treatment, an operation, or how long it took to travel from, I don't know, the front line to the base hospital or anything. Quote it. So literally take the whole sentence in. And if that does support some own knowledge, something that you already know, then that's useful because it supports your own knowledge. This will help us with accuracy. Okay, and then say what you know. I know that this is useful because I know that the base hospital was the last line on the evacuation chain, and this quote supports that as the ambulance driver is discussing how many miles it took to get from the casualty clearing station or whatever it might be. Just put in some own knowledge. If it's a picture, then obviously just say the source shows me that, or it shows me an image of 4 soldiers sitting outside the casualty clearing station. They have head injuries, foot injuries. I can tell this because it shows me in the picture they have bandages to their heads. I also know that in the casualty clearing station, operations were regularly done due to the sheer amount of soldiers that went through that stage of the evacuation. So just pick out something from the sources and then what do you know from your own knowledge. All right, the discussion of the limitations, the thing that everyone goes to as a bit of a safety net is that it only shows one ambulance or it only shows us one soldier. That it's a valid limitation, but just think to yourself, if you went anywhere else along the Western Front, would you see a similar image or a similar picture or the layout of a trench? And if you would, then that's typical. Okay, so that will probably be still useful. But of course you can discuss the fact that this particular source does only show you one. Okay, but try and turn everything positive if we can. All right. So thinking to the fact, have we overcomplicated things in class over the last couple of years? We started with NOPCAT, so nature, origin, purpose, context, content, complete, accurate, and typical. So we had all these things that we're going to try and tick off every time we look at a source. And perhaps some of you like NOPCAT in the discussion we've had in class, you clearly have. Some of you don't. Okay, and it's not wrong, but over the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to have a little look through some other ways to think about it. All right, so just a reminder of what those things were. So the nature of a source. What is the source? Is it a photograph? Is it a letter? Is it a speech? Is it a diary? Is it a newspaper article? Whatever it is certainly has an effect on how useful the source is to us. Okay, remember, being positive. A diary, it's someone's own feelings, their own views, it's how they felt or thought at the time. Therefore, that is absolutely useful. Okay, although they could be over emotional, it could be sort of too raw, so the things that they say might be a little bit more exaggerated. But if it's a diary of a nurse, or if it's a diary of a RAMC medic at the front line, or a stretcher bearer, probably what they say is what happened. I'm sure they're not going to forget the things that they've seen whilst picking up the soldiers. Okay, so then the origin. So the origin of a source is, when was it made? Who made it? Where, maybe? Obviously that gets us into the realms of, it was from the time, it was July 1916. This was right at the start of the Battle of the Somme. Who made it? A soldier, a surgeon, a nurse. These are the people that are there in the middle of this war, seeing the things that they see. Now, of course, like we've just said, they could be over emotional, they could exaggerate perhaps, but as long as we can say what they have said in their source matches what we know was going on, particularly in the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele, or the first use of gas, or the Second Battle of Ypres, whatever, we need to be thinking about whether or not that supports what we know. Okay, then P. I always struggle a little bit with P. Sometimes it's really obvious what the purpose of the source was or why it was made. Sometimes it's not. If it is, then explain why it was made. Sometimes if it was made to make people back home feel good, it may not show the brutality of the war. It may not show or talk about some of the actual injuries. However, we can discuss that, and we can say this source, although it does not show us some serious injuries, what it does do is it shows us that the government did try, in fact, to make people at home feel less stressed. And remember, their husbands and brothers and sons and fathers, they were out in this war. So perhaps the purpose of it can affect how useful a source is as well. Then we get to these C's. So context. What was going on around the time? What was going on at the time of the source? You should see the date at the top in the provenance. And you've obviously established that already by discussing that in the origin part. If it's in July or August or September of 1916, you know we're going through the Somme, Britain's arguably biggest military defeat of all time. Content. Now, content we'll come to in a minute in a separate an acronym, but content is, what does the source tell us? We've sort of mentioned that already. What does it tell us and what does it show us? Then complete. Is the source complete? And this is a little bit dangerous, because if we think about complete, this starts taking us towards that this source is not useful because it only shows one part of the Western Front, or one regimental aid post, or one injury. So the source is not complete, therefore affects its usefulness, and that is a valid and fair limitation, but we've got to be careful that we don't go off on a big negative about the source. So then we get to the A. How accurate is the source that you're looking at? And that only really comes in to support your own knowledge. All right, if this source tells you or shows us something that we know, then of course the source is accurate and makes it more useful. If the source is saying things that contradict what we think, or what we know, or what we'd expect to see or read about this event, then perhaps the source is going to be less useful. And then lastly, typical. All right, so typical is just simply means, like I said earlier, if you went anywhere else on the Western Front, is what you're looking at in this source, is it typical? Would you expect to see it somewhere else? And if you would, then that is a positive, and that would certainly help make the source a little bit useful. So breaking down that NOPCAT again, perhaps we've got ourselves a little bit wound up. I've got to do the N, oh, I've got to do the O, I've got to do the P, C, oh, I've got to do all this, and then before we know it, we've run out of time, or we've spent 45 minutes on this question. Now remember, it is only worth 8 marks. All right, so maybe that is the case. Would it be easier to just think about the 5 W's? So instead of thinking of the letters N, O, P, C, A, T, could you just think, okay, I've got the source in front of me. What about who, what, where, why, when? So who made it? Where was it made? When was it made? Why was it made? What does it show me? If that's easier, then perhaps use that as well. Remember, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say how the source is useful for a specific inquiry. All right, so okay, NOPCAT, we know what we're doing. We can analyse the source. Looking through your mock papers, you've highlighted and underlined all of the right bits, but then hasn't really translated into your answer. Okay, so we need to make sure that we're not spending ages highlighting and underlining the sources and not able to write anything. So then moving onward, having a little think, could we possibly change it a little bit? So we've come up with COP, or I've seen it out and about, so I thought we'd try it. We get rid of NOPCAT, send that to hell. Just a little note here, that does not mean that NOPCAT is wrong. It just means that COP might help you, or maybe a little bit easier. Okay, so the COP is very, very simple, and I think much simpler than NOPCAT. So it's the content. What does the source tell us? What does it show us in relation to our question's focus? Own knowledge. What do we know? What do we know about that particular event, source, focus, treatment, whatever it is? What do we already know that we can bring into this question to tell us that it's useful or not? And then lastly, P is provenance. So the provenance is that little bit of text that's on the top of all sources. Wherever we see a source, there's a little bit of writing, usually a smaller font or in italics, that tells us the nature, the origin and the purpose. Okay, so what the source is, who made it and when. So that's still NOP, but in this new acronym, it's all together. So content and own knowledge and then the provenance. But we've got to make sure that when we pick out these things, the C, the O and the P, we have to make sure we say this makes the source useful because. And I think that's sometimes where we're struggling a little bit. All right, so let's break this down a little bit. How do we set up our answer? So we do source A first. Just one big paragraph that includes some content, some own knowledge, and a discussion of the provenance and how the provenance helps make the source useful. It was made by a RAMC medic who was a stretcher bearer in the Battle of the Somme, and he wrote this 3 days after the first day, whatever it might be. Okay, and we just do one big paragraph, and it's all in there. The content, the source shows me that, or the source says that, with the quote. Plus, I know this from my own knowledge that X, Y, and Z happened. So that's the first one. All right, then we simply repeat for source B. Again, COP. And then before we know it, we've got two nice paragraphs full of lots of discussion about how the content, own knowledge, and provenance have made this source useful to whatever the inquiry might be. Okay, then we move on. We need to make sure that we're not going beyond 15, 16, maybe 18 minutes max on this question. Remember, it's only worth 8 marks and we have an awful lot to do in paper 1 with the whole medicine bit afterwards. Okay, so some language thinking about this, how we might want to write it. Okay, so the source was written by X. This makes it useful because. So that's a discussion of origin and the provenance and the purpose, and they were there, so they were important. And you can see the examples on the screen. The source shows us or tells us. Pick out a quote. You put the quote in there, which I know was true because blah 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 blah. This makes it more useful because. The source would be more useful if it included, so perhaps you could say something in there, a second RAMC medic, or a second view from a stretcher bearer, or whatever it might be. This might make it more useful. Doesn't mean this is not useful. It just means that it would be more useful if you included something else. We could say the source is a photograph, a letter, a diary. This makes it useful. A photograph is a snapshot in time of an event, showing us what it was like. So, and then a bit of own knowledge there. I also know that the trenches were waterlogged in the winter, or Passchendaele was swamped. This photograph supports my own knowledge. It could even be a diary, would be written for personal reasons, not to be read by anyone else. So, why would he lie? There's no need to lie. He's writing it for himself. This probably gives us a real good indication of what he's thinking and feeling at the time, and must have happened. Okay, but with the slight possibility that he is emotional about whatever he's just seen. It might be his best friend that's just been killed, or whatever it might be. Or we could say it's a painting which shows an interpretation of an event. Normally a painting has been done for a purpose. It could have been, like we said before, the government trying to portray this as better than it was. It could be done after the event, so it's really being based on what somebody can remember. But if they've spent any time at all in a trench or in those conditions, then they probably know what it was like. So it's probably a fair image or picture of what this person remembers. But of course, you yourself, you will know what the trenches look like. You'll know what no man's land looked like. You know all those things. So this painting is going to support your own knowledge. Okay, so I'll give you something to say. So this is an example on the board. I'm not going to read it all. You can pause the video and have a little read yourself. But this would be the first half of our first paragraph. I've made it up. It's not based on any particular source really, which makes this a little bit more difficult. But you can see, hopefully, where we've got a bit of content and a bit of own knowledge. The green underlined is the focus of the question, the inquiry. It doesn't matter what the sources say or do if we are not matching it to the actual inquiry. In this case, this made up one that I've done, it was asking how useful are these two sources for an, I don't know, investigation into the understanding of trench warfare, something like that. Okay, so we need to make sure we keep referring back to that. The dark blue are quotes, so I've taken them from the source. You just press pause now, have a little read through this and see what you think. It might even be useful to have a little time to go at writing this down, see how long it takes to write this. And hopefully if it's a bit slower, then the more we practice, the quicker it gets. So this would be the first half of the first paragraph. Okay, so have a little pause now and have a read. Remember, the inquiry here is the understanding of trench warfare. So not the injuries so much, but actually how they fought, going over the top, blah, 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 things like that. Okay, so pause, have a little read, and then we'll move on. Okay, so this is the second half of that first paragraph. We've done C and O of COP. This is now the P, so the provenance. This is NOP. So have a little read through this again. You can see hopefully that there's quite clear information there about what it is. In this case, it was a diary written by Private Jones. So diary is the nature. He's writing this in July 1916, which is right at the start of the Battle of the Somme. And his purpose, you can sort of work out there. There's a little bit of limitation in, but have a read of this one. And then again, like the last one, if you want to pause it and try and copy this, see how long it takes you to add this to the first half of your last paragraph. Those two things together give us a good, strong paragraph. And of course, then we would just repeat that for the second source. Okay, so have a little read of this and then pause and see how we get on. And then we'll move on. Okay, hopefully that was helpful in practicing and sort of seeing how it might be structured. Just got to practice. This question is a skilled question, which means we can just practice and practice and practice and get better and better and better. Some, in fact, most of our questions are essays. They require a good knowledge. They require you the ability to infer or imply or read between the lines a lot more. You've got to know a lot of things and connect and compare and judge. And a lot of the time you can do that or you can't. Obviously we can try our best to get better, but with this question it's definitely a skill question where we can practice them and hopefully get these 8 marks in the bag. And if we do this for the Trenches paper and the Germany paper, then potentially we can absolutely get ourselves at least 16 marks just from practice. Alright, so let's move on a little bit. I feel like we're getting there, but we've just got to practice this question. There are loads of sources all over our website in the Trenches section and in the Germany section and in your 9 to 5 booklets. Just pick out 2 sources, maybe make up an inquiry question yourself, but generally speaking, in all the lessons on our website you'll see 2 sources with a question that you can just practice and of course get it marked, hand it in and see how we get on.